Welcome to the third session of Exodus, Marching to Sinai, where we will take a careful study of the story of Exodus as the narrative leads to the revelation at Mount Sinai. This is this is part of Rabbi Silber's ongoing series covering the first two books of Tanakh. Rabbi Silber, we are always happy to have teach at Drisha. He is the founder and dean and published author. We're glad that so many of you keep showing up for this class. Just a quick housekeeping note for today's class. We very much want to hear your questions and thoughts, but please keep yourself muted if you are not actively asking a question, as we sometimes can and will pick up on background noise, and that's not why you want to get spotlighted. You can always ask questions in chat, and I will bring them to Rabbi Silber's attention as soon as I can. And we might not be able to get to your question, whether it's in person or in chat immediately, but we will do our best to get to it. Sources for today's class are coming primarily from the end of chapter 15 and 16 of Shemot. If you have your preferred Tanakh, please keep it at hand. Sources will also be on screen from Sefaria. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Okay, so we'll continue our own little journey here in the book of Exodus, Sefer Shemot. So Israel has crossed over the sea. We have looked at the song of the sea, and now we begin the journey in the desert. So let's just back up again to the 22nd pasuk of chapter 15, towards the end of chapter 15. Vayasa Moshe Yisrael miyam suf, vayetzu el midbar shur, vayechu shloshet yamim bamidbar v'lo matzu mayim. So actually, verse number 22, that Moshe, here they translate, caused Israel to a journey, and they went into the Midbar Shur, the desert of Shur. They walked 3 days, and they did not find water. The commentaries notice the unusual use of the word linsoa, to travel, vayasa Moshe Yisrael, that Moshe caused them to journey. Usually in the Torah, it would say Vayisu b'nei Yisrael, Israel journeyed. Vayasa suggests that Moshe is causing them to leave, that somehow, for whatever reason, they don't want to leave. And again, the question is, why would they not want to leave? Rashi cites one midrashic view that they were busy picking up all the spoils, that the Egyptians who had drowned in the sea had left a lot of spoils on the side of the sea, and that Israel was preoccupied with gathering up the spoils, the gold and the silver, etc. That's one point of view. That probably is not casting the best light upon Israel, but that's one view. One could pick up, the question that Rashi raises, which is, of course, a very valid question. The use of Vayasa, we could say something else, which I think the story picks up, which is at the sea they witnessed God's hand, and they all saw it. They saw God who brings about victory, and they're standing in God's presence, as it were. And now they're about to journey into a desert, into the unknown, and maybe the text is expressing an element of hesitation or doubt about what's going to happen when they leave the presence of God, the warrior, Hashem Ish Milchama, and they begin a journey into parts unknown, and not only that, into a desert. And the very first verse that we just read, they walked for 3 days and they couldn't find water. And the contrast between what we just read, the song of the sea, the song of the Yamsuf, and the victory that God brings about at the Yam. And now we have no water. 3 days in the desert and there's no water. So the contrast between what previously we read and they experienced, and the present situation, suddenly they're in a place where there's no water. And we can translate into say no water, where the absence of God is felt. There's no obvious God. And now the question is how Israel will respond to being in the desert, and the sharp contrast between what preceded. And not only that, in the 22nd verse, but the next pasuk also, Vayovom Marata. After journeying for 3 days and not finding water, they come to a place called Marah. Marata means to Marah, as Rashi points out. When the hey is the last letter of the root, the word, then we put in the tuf, Marata. El Marah becomes Marata. Rashi cites many examples of that. They come to a place called Marah. But they could not drink any water in Marah. There is water there, but the water is Marah. The water is bitter. The water is undrinkable. Kimarimem. 3 times we have the word Marah over here. And in a way that's even more frustrating. They finally find water, but the water is not drinkable. And the Torah says, Al-Kain Karash Shema Marah. In fact, that's why the place is called Marah. It's called Marah because of the Mayim Hamorim, the bitter waters. We are reminded, perhaps, I just thought of this off the top of my head, but that we do have in the Torah elsewhere, Mayim Marim. There's another place in the Torah where the Torah speaks of bitter waters. And of course, that's the story of the Sota, the bitter waters of the Sota. And that the bitter waters of the Sota, that's when the husband accuses the wife of infidelity, and he brings her to the Kohen in the 5th chapter of Bamidbar, and she undergoes this trial by ordeal. It's not exactly a trial by ordeal, but she undergoes this trial, and part of it is she has to drink these bitter waters. If she's innocent, the waters will have no negative effect on her, and if she's guilty, she'll be punished. She will shrivel up and be punished. But I was thinking that actually the Mehamarim over there, what the bitter waters are in the Sota story, what they are an expression of is a lack of trust, a failure in the relationship between the husband and wife. So over here, I'm wondering whether the bitter waters actually, in light of the later Sota passages, aren't really an expression of a kind of, one might say, falling out, or a kind of, I'm not saying distrust, but a lack of faith, as it were. The people are traveling in the desert. They come to the place, and we encounter the Mehamorim. And clearly, there is a lack of faith, because the very next verse says, Vayilonu al Moshe lemor manishter. The people complained. Vayilonu, they said to Moshe, manishter, what shall we drink? Now, I would say the following about that from one perspective, it's a very valid question. You're traveling in the desert and there's no water. Now, we know, even from the stories in the Torah, we know the story of Yishmael in the desert. We know the story of Yosef. Aborek ein bo mayim. Joseph will die in the pit because there's no water. Ishmael will die in the desert. Hagar, his mother, thinks he will certainly die, maybe she as well, because there's no water. So from one perspective, their complaint is completely valid. However, what's interesting is that the Torah did use the word vayilonu. Here they translate grumbled or complained. The word grumbled is here. So in other words, it's one thing to say, listen, we need water. But the use of the word vayilonu suggests that it's more than just a question. And they've just seen the fact that God redeemed them upon the waters. And it's a valid question to say, okay, what does God have in mind now? But the vayilonu suggests a lack of trust or a lack of faith. So I'm just wondering whether the reader, when in reading the Torah, in reading on and encountering the Sota passage, whether we now think back to this passage over here, or whether we could say that the reader of the Torah already knows of that passage, and that the Torah is recalling for the reader a passage that appears later in the Torah but is known to the reader. The question is, who was the reader? That's always a big question. But it's certainly, the parallel is actually, I think, rather striking. In any event, here we have the contrast. And there's something else here as well. And after this, I'll stop and take any comments or questions. There's something else very curious about this Marah, because in the previous passages are about the Song of the Sea. But remember that the last word, the Song of the Sea, Oz Yeshir Moshe Uvenei Yisrael, and we have this long song. But the capstone, the very last verse of the Song of the Sea was not sung by Moshe and Israel, but rather the very last verse, verse number 20, the last verse of Shirat Hayam, Vatikach Miriam Hanaviyah. And then verse 21, Vatan Lahem Miriam. Shiru Hashem ki ga'o ga'a, sus v'rochvo ramah vayam. So we have Miriam mentioned twice. She leads the women in song. Shiru Hashem ki ga'o ga'a. And as I mentioned last time, the story of the Exodus, in a sense, the actual Exodus, concludes with the women. They were responsible for the redemption, and Miriam in particular. If we align her with the sister of Moses, who's watching out for him in chapter 2, she's to some extent responsible or makes possible Moses' birth and Moses' survival. So it's only fitting that the women get the last word. But here the question is the Torah playing with, on one hand, Miriam at the sea, and the other hand, Marim in Marah? Because the two words have exactly the same letters: Mem, Resh, Yud, Mem, Mem, Resh, Yud, Mem. So the contrast between the singing at the sea, in other words, the contrast to sharpen it, the contrast between Batoshar, right, Shibru Hashem, Shira on one hand, and over here we have Vayilonu, Mitlonanim, complaint on the other. The contrast between the two couldn't be more striking. That on one hand we have the song of Miriam, and now we have the Tuna of Marim. In short, what the Chumash is, I think, pointing towards is that we Israel, are now in a completely different place. It's the absence of water, and more than that, the absence of God's presence, or at least the sense that the people have that God is not with them. And they turn to Moshe and they say, what are we going to do? Vayilonu. Moshe, you brought us here. Tell us, what are we going to do? We have no water. And the water we find, even worse, is actually Marah, or Marim, is bitter water. Here we have the very striking contrast between these two. I would just add one point, and then I'll stop and take any comments or questions. And that in the Song of the Sea, I think if we think about it in a deeper way, in the Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam, the very beginning of the Song of the Sea, which is all about God, and God who vanquishes Israel's enemy, and God who brings about redemption, brings them across, etc. But the beginning of the Shira, God is described as Hashem, that's God's name. Hashem Ish Milchama, Hashem Shemo. God is the God of war. Hashem is the God of war. That is God's name. The Hashem, the Yud-Hey Vav-Hey that the people sing of in the Song of the Sea, is the God of war. And in thinking about it, the people's experience of this God is not only at the sea, where God defeated Israel's enemies, God's enemies, Israel's enemies, but if we think about the God that people experienced in Egypt, it was the God of the 10 plagues. It was the God of smiting the firstborn. It was the God of the very first plague, turning the water into blood. That was the first plague, and in a sense, that's what the story of Shirat Hayam is as well. The Egyptians drowned in the sea. The water which was earlier used to that the Jewish blood would be thrown into the water, the babies, and now the tables are turned. But now when we come to the desert, it's not about a God of war. There's no war here. And the question becomes, this God of war is Hashem Ish Milchama. That's fine when you're fighting wars. But now the question becomes, is that God of war the same God who can take care of us, who can provide us with basic human needs, can protect us from the elements, etc.? That's maybe the people's question, because they have never experienced that kind of God. The God they experienced, and especially in previously in this chapter, is Hashem Ish Milchama. So in the deepest sense, that's really the question that the Torah raises for us, and the question perhaps that the people's question. What are we going to drink? Who's going to provide us with the water to drink? Not the imperial God who slays God's enemies or our enemies, but who's going to provide us? Who's going to nurture us? Who's going to care for us? That's the question. Let me stop here for a moment and take any comments or questions that people might have.
This is a question from Laszlo Marcus in chat. What is the root of the word vayilanu? I'm just not familiar with it.
Vayilonu. No, so vayilonu comes up in the Torah we have in modern Hebrew also to be mitlonein. Means to complain. Tchunot b'nei Yisrael. It comes up often in the Torah. Tchunot are complaints. The specific shorishness, I don't know the etymology and all that, but that's how it appears in the biblical text. Tchunot are complaints. Tchunot echem, tchunot b'nei Yisrael, mitlonenim. It means to complain, and it's, again, as I point out, it's in a way the opposite of what we just encountered, which is Shiru Hashem ki ga'oga, to sing a joyous song. And this is not a joyous song. This is a dirge of sorts. It's a complaint. So it's just another example of the contrast. What I'm pointing out is the contrast between what we read last time, the beginning of the chapter, and not what we're encountering over here. And I made a suggestion as to account for that. The God, the people of this God, who is this God? Is this a caring and nurturing God or just a warrior God? That's the question. That's what the people want to know. Who's going to take care of us in this desert when there's no water? On the contrary, the very water that we find is undrinkable water, is marim. Anybody else for a comment or question?
I always thought it was fascinating that it's the same aliyah.
Yeah.
That rather than the aliyah ending on a high with the shira, they put this in also. That
Right.
You can't even have a positive, a pure positive. You have to have this in there also.
Right. I mean, it does end on a different high, but I mean, the larger question you're raising is a very interesting question about where the breaks where we make aliyot, actually. I mean, there are certain rules about where one can stop in reading the Torah. There's certain rules about how the verses are set up, etc. But we do typically try to end on a positive note when possible. Sometimes it's hard to find too many positives, but it's a general and interesting question that we do combine this into one aliyah. Again, it's a much bigger question about the aliyot, I think, and there are a lot of questions one can ask about where the aliyot are broken up. I was just thinking about this just since you raised the question, a small digression, which is not really terribly relevant to your question. I mean, not directly relevant, but I just got back from Israel, and just landed yesterday. That was Thursday night, whatever it was, and so I remember when I was in Israel for Parshat Breshit. So there were two customs where when one of the aliyot in Breshit, there are two different customs. There's a very short aliyah in Breshit, and one custom ends with the verse with the birth of Enosh, the son of Shet. Oz huchal likro b'shem Hashem. Oz huchal, people then began to call out in God's name. That's one tradition, and then the other tradition is not to stop there, but to stop in a different verse, a couple of verses from there. And I was just thinking about that. The Beit Knesset I was in on that particular Shabbat did stop at Oz huchal likro b'shem Hashem. They made that stop, but most of the places where I have been, they don't stop there. And what's interesting is that sometimes the very place that one stops or not is a function of how one interprets the verse. Because it says, when Enosh was born, people then began to call out in God's name. And the question is that a positive or a negative? So the Medrash understands, and Rashi quotes it, people began to, from the word of chol, they began to denigrate the name of God. They began to worship other gods. And the Medrash picks up on the word chuchal as a negative. The plain reading of the verse is not negative. People began to call in God's name. The Ramban typically tries to bridge both. Ramban says it means people began to call out in God's name, but it became necessary to call out in God's name because other people were not calling out in God's name. It's a typical Ramban move, how he defends the Medrash on one hand and sticks to the text on the other. So I was just thinking that this question, do you stop at that verse or not, actually is probably related to the question, is it positive or negative? Do you see calling out in God's name? I mean, Avram calls out in God's name. Avram calls out in God. We just read it this week's parsha. Lechucha, Avram vayikra Avram b'shem Hashem. It's positive. But the Midrashim see it negatively, and those two customs, do you stop there or not, is actually probably related to that very interpretive question. Anyway, I just point out as one example of the question of where we make our stops and not. So yes, over here, it's very true. We don't stop right after the Shira. We continue for a few more verses, and we include the story within the same Aliyah. And the story clearly is the opposite. It's quite the opposite of what we just experienced. No water, bitter water, no Miriam but Marim, etc. No Shira but Vayilona. Okay, so we'll see where all this goes. And now we have, so people complain to Moshe. Now we continue the next verse. Vayitzaka Hashem, Vayorehu Hashem eitz, Vayashrechu Hamayim, Vayimtiku Hamayim. Sham Sam Lo Choku Mishpat, V'Sham Nisahu. So said the people complained to Moshe, and Moshe cried out to God. Vayitzaka Hashem, Moshe prays or cries out. Not just Vayit Palel, Vayitzaka, it's a kind of desperation. He cries out to God. It said, and God by Yorehu, God teaches him the word Torah. God shows him an eitz, a piece of wood, which Moshe throws into the water. Vayimtiku hamayim, and the water became sweet. It sweetened the waters. That's the first half of this verse. And the second half of the verse is Sham, Sam lo choku mishpat, V'Sham nisahu. There, they translate there, God made for them, what's the rest of the verse over there? God made for them a fixed, how do they translate? Scroll down. Yeah. A fixed rule. There they were put to the test. Okay. So one question is, first of all, okay, so God is showing Moshe, throw something into the water, which has the effect of curing the water, let's say. Okay, curing the water. But what is the relationship between the first half of the verse and the next half of the verse? The first says the waters were cured. The second half says that there in Mara, God samlo choku mishpat. The term choku mishpat, we've seen chukim mishpatim, is a common term in the Torah. Statutes, ordinances, v'sham nisahu, and there God tested them. What is the relationship between part A and part B? So for Rashi, I think, and Rashi simply quotes the Gemara, there isn't necessarily a relationship, direct relationship. Rashi's Rashi's understanding of Sham Sam Lo Choku Mishpat V'Sham Nisahu, Chukimu Mishpatim, says Rashi. In Mara, okay, the waters were cured. In Mara, God gave Israel Chukimu Mishpatim. In other words, what is Mara for Rashi? The Gemara. Mara is, one might say, a precursor to Sinai. The people are given chok umishpat. Now, the Torah doesn't tell us which chukim and mishpatim were given in Mara. According to Rashi, according the Gemara, gives us a list of chukim and mishpatim. For example, Rashi says they were given dinim, they were given laws related to human interaction, dinim. Rashi says they were given Shabbat. Why does Rashi say they were given Shabbat, which appears later in the Ten Commandments? But why does Rashi say they're given Shabbat? Because in the next chapter, story of the man that we're going to start soon, there one of the rules that God says to Moshe, tell the people to gather the double portion on Friday. On the sixth day, on Shabbat, you can't go out and collect the food. So given the fact that Shabbat figures in chapter 16, so the Gemara, Rashi, says that one of the chukim and mishpatim would be Shabbat. Then Rashi mentions para aduma, the red heifer. Where does Rashi get the red heifer from? Well, of course, the red heifer is the classic chok. If we translate chok, as some do, as a mitzvah whose reasons are beyond our understanding, or we don't know the reasons. Rashi thinks there are some mitzvot that there maybe are no reasons. It's just arbitrary. God says, do this because I say so. That's Rashi's view. It's not the view of the Maimonides, the Nachmanides, and many others. But so in short, Choku Mishpat for Rashi, based on the Gemara, Mara is the first stop. That as they begin to walk in the desert, we're headed towards Sinai. But the first stop is at Mara, the people are given Choku Mishpat. Now, if we ask ourselves the question, Rashi didn't make this up. Rashi quotes, Rashi is the voice of the Midrash, voice of the Gemara, etc. But I did want to reflect upon what Rashi is saying over here, and then we'll get to a different possibility. Of course, the Ramban differs completely. But for Rashi, first of all, we've seen this before. For Rashi, the idea of the Torah in general, it's a book of commandments. So as we begin the journey, the first thing is to begin to be a commanded people. We already had certain commandments back in Egypt, Paschal sacrifice, the rules of the Paschal sacrifice, etc. But now we have something much more general, Choku Mishpat, Chukim and Mishpatim. And for Rashi, you begin the journey with Choku Mishpat. Now, why Chok and Mishpat are so significant? This is a big question, obviously, and not in the class on studying Chumash here. We're going to get into this very broad question about Chok and Mishpat. But I will say that at least one way to understand Chok and Mishpat, the idea of having these rules, what the rules do, basically, what the mitzvot do, mitzvot, chukim, and mishpatim. One of the things that they accomplish is that they sort of regulate your life. In other words, you have a set rule, you have a discipline. This is the path that you follow. On certain days, you do this. There's special days. It regulates your life. And we're talking about walking into a desert. And the first thing that people say is, there's nothing in this desert. It's completely empty. There's not even basic necessities of life. There's no water, and the next complaint will be there's no food. Those are very valid concerns. So in the midst of all this anarchy over here, the Choku Mishpat is a way to regulate your life, to give you a sense of order. And perhaps that's part of it. The desert is an empty space. And when you first walk into the desert, the first thing you would need is some kind of regulation of your life, some kind of discipline. So that perhaps is one of the things that Rashi bases on the Gemara, but maybe the Gemara is picking up on this, the need for Choku Mishpat in terms of something to give us an order, something that, to regulate your life. It's something that, for example, Rabbi Soloveitchik in his writings about mitzvot, etc., his own take on the mitzvot, he said many things, but one of them was, the Torah gives you the way to order your life, and he believed that if we leave it up to human beings, I'm not getting into this now, I'm not saying one way or the other, I'm just reporting. You believe when human beings make up the rules is when you get into big trouble.
But
Okay,
you know the meanings of the chok that also regulates you. It's still baffling not to know.
right. The chukim, at least for Rashi, means that are mitzvos whose reasons we don't necessarily know. Rashi is not the majority view in that, but that is Rashi's opinion. But nonetheless, the fact that God commands you to do it, okay, that gives you a certain seder in life, and that's probably part of what the significance of mitzvot. In any event, Rashi's understanding is the Gemara, that the first thing that you get are mitzvot, or in the words of the Talmud, mitzvot sheb'mara, the mitzvot of Mara. Now, over and against Rashi, the Ramban, of course, cites Rashi. V'eino nachon, says the Ramban, that is not right. In other words, the Ramban knows the Gemara. Ramban knows all the Gemaras, actually, but the Ramban says that's not the pshat. In terms of the Chumash, the Ramban is after the Pshuto Shel Mikra, and the Pshuto Shel Mikra, says the Ramban, is not what Rashi says. Choku Mishpat over here does not mean mitzvot. Choku Mishpat, for the Ramban, is a way to live, specifically a way to live in the desert. And for the Ramban, it's a combination of two things. First of all, it's about living with faith. Choku Mishpat means this is the way you function in the desert. And the second thing for the Ramban is you have to learn how to cope with your environment. God tells Moshe, or actually shows Moshe how to purify the waters. So that's not a mitzvah, but you're in a desert. There are hardships of the desert, and you have to understand how to live in the desert. In fact, for the Ramban, the idea of teaching people how to live is probably related to the end of the verse, Sham Sam Lo Choku Mishpat B'Sham Nisahu, which they translate as to test or to try them. But for the Ramban, Choku Mishpat B'Sham Nisahu is all part of one thing. You're starting to walk in the desert. You're not going to have a lot of food. You're not going to have water. You have the hardships of the desert. You have the heat of the desert, etc., etc., etc. And you have to learn how to live under those conditions. And for the Ramban, that's what the Ramban said. It's not, yes, he knows the Gemara, talks about the mitzvot, but the Ramban says that's not the pshat of the pasuk. The pshat is choku mishpat, chukim, right? The chukim is sort of the rules. Chukot shamayim va'aretz. The text speaks of the rules of heaven and earth. The way the stars move, the way the sun moves, the way the moon moves, the earth moves. Those are the chukim of heaven and earth. It's understanding how to live, understanding what you face in terms of nature, in terms of the environment. That's the Ramban. I would add one point over here in terms of Rashi and the Ramban that I think is, and we've seen this already, that the Rashi's focus in his parish on the Torah, maybe his main focus. For Rashi, the Torah is a book of rules and laws. It's a book of mitzvot. The very first Rashi. Why does the Torah start with Breshit bara Elohim? The Torah should have started with Achoresh Hazel Lechem Rosh Chodashim. It's the first mitzvah. So that's Rashi. And Rashi is consistent throughout his commentary. And the Ramban is equally consistent. He rejects that. The Torah is not only a book of mitzvot. Yes, mitzvot are very central to the Torah, but they're not enough. The Torah is about other things. It's about articles of faith and belief. It's about becoming a holy person, kadoshim tiyu. That's the goal, to live the holy life. So for the Ramban, it's typical. Rashi understands choku mishpat as mitzvahs. And the Ramban says that's not what it means. It's not about the mitzvot, which of course the Ramban endorses the mitzvot 1,000%, but he says that's not what it means over here. It's a way to live your life in light of the hardships that you face. Living your life transcends the mitzvot. The mitzvot are part of it. But the goal is to live the sacred life, the kadoshim tiyu. That's the Ramban's goal. The mitzvot help you get there. and maybe they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. So here we have a very typical machloket between Rashi and the Ramban. What does it mean? Sham sam lo choku mishpat v'sham nisahu. Let me just say one more word, and I'll stop and take any comments or questions, because there's a lot here. But one word I wanted to focus on, because it's a key word in the next couple of chapters, and that's the word v'sham nisahu. And there, sham nisahu, God tested them. Sham nisahu. Now we have the word linasot or nisayon or nisa. We have the word elsewhere in the Torah, and in fact, we have it in this coming week's Torah reading, Parshat Vayera, in a story we're all quite familiar with, chapter 22 of Genesis, the binding of Isaac. Elohim nisa et Abraham. After these things, Elohim nisa et Abraham, translated typically as God tested Abraham, or God tried Abraham. It's a nisayon, it's a trial or a test. So there the Torah says that God is testing Abraham. Torah says it straight out. And over here we have nisahu. Here we have God testing them. And the question this raises is, what is the purpose of the test? What is the purpose of the test? So maybe if we understand the purpose of the test over here, we'll then go back and understand the purpose of the test in the story of Abraham and the Akedah. In terms of Abraham and the Akedah, so we have two opinions that have been mentioned by our by the Rambam and the Ramban, two titans. The Rambam had one point of view about the test, and the Ramban had a different point of view about the test. I don't believe that either one necessarily is the best pshat. The Rambam certainly is not the pshat of the Chumash, and I don't think the Ramban is either. But let me just report what the Rambam and the Ramban said about testing. Because as we shall see, the idea of test, and the nasot, nisahu, is probably the critical word in the next several stories. The next several stories are all about the test, nasot. The Rambam says famously, what do you mean God tested Abraham? So, of course, they're all bothered by, why does God have to test anything? In other words, if you give a test, let's say I have a class, I say, okay, students, we all studied, I'm going to give you a test. What is typically the point of the test? You take a test in school. Most of the time, it's diagnostic for the teacher. The teacher wants to know, I've been teaching the whole time. Does anybody understand what they're actually teaching? Does anybody understand the material? So you give a test, and you find out who actually understood the material. That's the idea of the test. If you understood the material, you'll get a good grade or whatever. But the idea is to understand whether the student understood the material. The Rambam says something similar. The Rambam says that God testing Abraham, it wasn't really about Abraham actually, but rather it's instructional for the reader of the story. Abraham doesn't need to be tested, but you read about the test. The reader of the Torah, says the Rambam. That's the Rambam. The reader of the Torah will understand that what it means to live the holy life, what it means to follow God's command, etc. That's the Rambam. So it's not for the purpose of the test is not directed towards Abraham for the Rambam. It's directed towards the reader of the story. I mean, obviously, anybody who's studied with me understands that position would be completely unacceptable to me, because you're going outside the story, and that strikes me as certainly not consonant with any way in which I've been teaching and studying. So, whatever you think of it, it certainly doesn't resonate with anything we do in these classes. That's the Rambam. The Ramban doesn't like it either. The Ramban has a different idea, that people get rewarded for, it's not that God knows, but the idea is that God is testing Abraham because God knows Abraham is a saintly person, but you don't reward saintly people for having good thoughts in their head. You reward people for what they do. So the idea of the test is a way to test Abraham, have him pass the test, and then you can give him a kind of A+ because he's done well on the test. But he has to take the test, because otherwise, if he doesn't pass the test, doesn't agree to this ordeal, even though in his mind he would agree to it, you reward people for what they do and not for what they think. That's the Ramban. Again, that's the Ramban. It's the idea of giving Abraham a reward. The point is that the difficulty with the Ramban, I think, is that the Ramban presumes that the point of the test is you test somebody, or God tests Abraham, because God knows that Abraham's going to pass the test. It's a way to reward the good person for passing the test. However, the problem will be in our story over here that God will test Israel, but it would appear that they don't pass the test. I'm not talking about this verse. I'm talking about the next story we're going to encounter, one of the key stories of the book of Exodus and the Torah in general, story of the Mon. And there, God will say straight up, I'm going to test them. And it would appear that they don't do very well on the test. There are two main points to the test, part A and part B. And it would appear that we didn't do so well on the two parts. Like maybe we failed. Maybe we got a 60 or something. I don't know. Maybe we got a 31. I'm not sure. But so it's not just to give rewards. Now, maybe the Ramban has something else in mind. And I want to mention that over here, just to recall what we said about the test of Abraham. And I think that probably is the pshat, in my view anyway, of what's going on with this testing in the stories that we started reading now. The claim that I made when we studied the story of the Akedah, which is this week's parsha, is that the idea of a test is not so much to give him a good grade, but the idea of a test or a trial is actually to educate Abraham, and that the test for Abraham, the Nisayon of the Akedah, will address the core issue in Abraham's life. He has one core issue in his life. Who is going to succeed me? That's the question for Abraham. God appears to Abraham when he's 75 years old. He has no heir. Who's going to succeed me? Abraham is a saintly person. Who's going to succeed Abraham? And that's not clear to Abraham who's going to succeed him. It would appear when you read the Chumash, he thinks Yishmael is going to succeed him, up to and including the point where he has to cast Yishmael out. But the point of the Akedah is for Avram to affirm that Yitzchak is his one and only covenantal heir. When we studied the Avram story, which we're not going to do now, we connected it to a different problem, which is, what is Sarah's role? Who is Sarah? God says Sarah is your partner in your covenantal destiny. That's it. God said that in chapter 17. In chapter 20, Abraham said to Abimelech, "She really is my sister." He allows it to be taken. So the point is, the Nisayon of Abraham, the great test, is an educational test. And most tests we take in life are not educational. It's rare that you learn from the test. I mentioned many times that the one teacher I had who gave tests, and you actually learned from the test, was Rabbi Lichtenstein. Because on his test, he gave you a question that you had never seen before. And you had to try to apply all of your knowledge to figure out what you would do in this particular case. He didn't actually care which way you came out with the case. He wanted to see your reasoning on all sides. What is your thinking? And then when you have these questions, you really begin to think very hard about what is it that you learned, how might you apply it, etc. So I think that the Nisayon of Abraham is not to reward him, but to educate him. And I believe that the stories that we're going to encounter, the story here, the story of the Mon in particular, is about educating the people, which is in line with the Ramban, because the Ramban is saying people have to learn how to live in the desert. People have to learn how to live when God is not obviously present. People have to learn to have faith, even when things seem to be going to be very difficult. So that's the Ramban. In any event, those are three possibilities. I point out now that the word Visham Nisahu, that word is going to be the if not the central word in the stories that we're going to be studying. Okay, let me take one more verse and then I'll stop and take any comments or questions. So now God says, Vayomer, Im Shamoah Tishma L'Kol Hashem Elohecha, if you will obey God, Vayashar B'Einav Taseh, you do what is right in God's eyes, V'Azanto L'Mitzvotav V'Shamato Kol Chukav, you listen to the mitzvot, you observe the chukim, Kol HaMachara Shesanti B'Mitzrayim L'Osim Alecha, then the plagues, the illnesses, the plagues that I brought upon Mitzrayim, I will not place upon you. Ki ani Hashem Rofecha, I am the God who is your healer. The point being that, again, that the first plague was the plague of Dam. The first plague was the water turned into blood. And what God says over here is that I taught you, what God said to Moshe is, Vayareo Hashem Eitz, God showed Moshe how to cure the waters, how to sweeten the waters. So if you follow my path, you won't be subject to what Mitzrayim is subject to. On the contrary, Ani Hashem Rofecha. I'm the God who heals you, and presumably, since I'm the God who heals you even after in times of distress, I'm also the God who will try to make sure that you don't get sick in the first place. Kind of preventive medicine. That's the message over here. You have to follow the right path. Hayashar b'Rav Taseh. There's Sita Hayashar. There's mitzvot. There's chukim. And that's the message over here. And this is where the Aliyah ends. So one gets a sense. It's a new journey. It's a new situation. But I'm the same God who punished the Egyptians and who drowned the Egyptians is the same God who can also heal. That, as I mentioned before, seems to be what is at the center of these verses and what's central to the complaint. And the question is, can God do both? At one time, Hashem ish milchama. At the same time, Ani Hashem rofecha. Let me stop here and take any comments or questions. There's actually many things in these few verses over here. And then we will begin with our next story, the story of the Mon.
I'd like to highlight some questions
Go ahead, please do.
Chat.
Yeah.
One moment, let me pull them. One moment, let me just pull them up from just in no particular order. From Neva, students should learn from tests, a newer way of thinking than when we were in school.
Is that a question or a comment?
Or a comment.
I agree.
And
in other words, the point of it, look.
Just a comment, disagreeing with you. And I think in the school that I work in, we really do work toward that. You know, tests really are, we work with students with learning disabilities. So we really don't want that. We want to set them up for success. And we do more dynamic assessments and assessments that they don't fail in general.
Right. I mean, there is certainly room for diagnostic tests. I'm not saying no. Of course, that's true. I'm just pointing out that sometimes I remember his test in particular. I was listening that the test was very interesting, actually, because it really got you to think. It got you to try to apply what you had been learning to a different situation, which was his way of. I mean, I presume if you really understand something, you can also apply it, and that was his. But it's at the same time, the very attempt to apply it was very interesting. So about 40% of the test was one question that you had never seen before. And as I mentioned, he had no interest in coming out on one side or other of the question. His interest was, can you understand the problems over here? What kind of problems do you have to address to try to arrive at some kind of an answer. That was his interest over there. But of course, we want to know what we have students. You want to know how much they understand, don't understand, etc. Of course, there's room for that as well, no doubt. Yeah. Anybody else?
Ruth, do you have a question? Ruth Ray-
Yes, I just, the discussion that we just heard about the difference between the Ramban's approach and the Rashi's approach. What are we supposed to do then with Rashi's declaration in Bereshit, in which he says, "I am only here to address the pshat"? Was he
Oh, that's a wonderful question, right? That's
fooling himself?
That's a wonderful question. What did Rashi mean by that? I mean, again, that's the big question. Because obviously Rashi may have said that. On the other hand, I mean, there's been reams written about that question, what Rashi meant when Rashi said pshat. Rashi is the voice of the Medrash. There's no question about that. Very often Rashi will quote more than one. It says the Medrash says X, and Pshuto Shel Mikra is something else. I think I would say one thing about Rashi. I mean, I'm not doing the question justice. The question is this is one of the biggest questions about Rashi HaTorah. What did Rashi mean? Because we know Rashi has Medrash, and not only that, we know the Rashbam claims he would study with his grandfather. Rashbam is the great Pashtan, and he said, my grandfather said to me, if he would write a new commentary on the Torah, he would do pshat. That Rashbam says this at the beginning of Parashat Vayeshev. So Rashi understood that the Rashbam's conception of pshat and his own are wildly different. I do think, though, what Rashi does try to do is he does try to address the problem of a particular verse. That I think Rashi does that. In other words, Rashi is less interested in being, for the most part, typically being coherent, having one position that runs through unlike the Ramban. I mean, certain things like the focus on mitzvot is consistent in Rashi because that's at the center of Rashi. But Rashi, there are a lot of contradictions in Rashi. Rashi will give the medrash that's most relevant to some question of this particular verse in one place. He'll say the opposite 3 chapters later. But your question is that is probably the key in studying Rashi. A lot of books about Rashi, and that's the question that's addressed front and center. What did Rashi mean when he said, "I'm out to do the pshat," which Rashi does say. So I don't have a good answer to that question. I mean, I made one suggestion, but the question is a very important question. But what I'm pointing out is whatever Rashi meant by that, what we would call pshat, I think, or what his grandson would call pshat, is far removed from what Rashi does typically. Okay, the best I can do at this point for that. That could be a course, maybe a course about Rashi. That would be the first question. What did Rashi mean when he does say that? Okay, is there anybody else?
Yeah, Chaim?
Is it possible to understand the term Visham Nisahu, that it was a test, or to use your terminology, it's not a test but a strengthening, creating resilience only for the men? The women were not avadim, and they, like Miriam and Marim are the same spelling, as you said. So the very same situation, if you have not been an Eved, is experienced one way, versus those who have been Avadim for a couple hundred years need a lot of strengthening. So Visham Nisahu, it was that the men were the ones who needed to be re-educated and to create resilience in them.
Okay, here's the point. It's an interesting question whether, again, the Torah doesn't speak that much about the women. I mean, Miriam is one of the great exceptions, actually. But typically when the Torah speaks about Israel, it uses the masculine voice. So it's very hard to know to what extent, the Midrashim tried to read in with the golden calf. The women really didn't want to get involved in that. The women didn't want to give up the jewelry, etc., etc. It's really hard to know because the Torah writes in male language. It doesn't say much about the women. In fact, just the answer is I don't know. I think it talks about Israel collectively. But I think that one of the interesting points that the feminists made, actually, which I think is a very interesting point, is when you read this verse that we read about Miriam, Vatikach Miriam Hanaviah, okay, or the verse that appears in one of the minor prophets, and I sent before you Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. And the truth of the matter is, the Torah doesn't say very much about Miriam. You have the story over here. You have Miriam complaining about Moshe in the book of Bamidbar. You have the sister, maybe it's Miriam who's watching over him. You have after her death, there's no water. But the truth of the matter is, there's not much said in the Torah about Miriam. There's a lot said about Moshe. It's probably the main character once you get out of Sefer Breshit. And what the feminists were claiming, and I think there's a lot to this, is that these remarks about, say, Miriam, for example, over here, there must have been, and there may well have been, an incredible amount of lore about Miriam. The Torah reflects maybe a very small piece of that, but their suggestion of some of them was that we have to go back into the text and try to figure out what else do we know about this person. Obviously, she's a critical character over here. She gets the last word in the song. She's called Hanaviah, which we don't have till you get to Moshe. No one else is called. Okay, Avram's a Navi, but Hanaviah, the prophetess. So they're one of the moves of some of the feminists who didn't just reject everything, said there's obviously the Torah is reflective of the fact that there's a lot more to be said about the women, which the Torah for whatever reason doesn't say, but maybe it behooves us to go back and try to flesh out some of these characters. But in terms of your point, I mean, it's an interesting point, and you have this on occasion with Chazal, where they emphasize the women weren't involved in this or that, etc. But it's very hard to make too many comments about it, just because in the Torah, the women are not that present. When you have the genealogies of the book of Breshit, there are virtually no women mentioned outside of Serach, Bat Asher, etc. It says, "Vayodu banim ubanot," but in terms of the names, for example, in the genealogies, they're all men. So again, it's because of the paucity of information that we have, it's very hard to know. Is there anybody else for a comment or question?
Yes, Rabbi Silber.
Yeah.
There is a change in tone in these Pesukim, which is very radically different. There we have a very straightforward telling of the tale, and all of a sudden this elevated language, it reminds you of the end of the Torah, where you have this kind of language. And it would seem that in this dispute as to what the Chok and Mishpat is, it's more than just Hukim and Mishpatim in the narrow sense, but it's some kind of healing of the soul, healing of the nation, and so forth. It's a broader concept.
I agree with you. Ani Hashem Rofecha is, I think it's a very soothing term. It's a very, it's much more intimate. It's not just these are the mitzvot, do them, but I'm the God who's here. I'm here to help you. I'm here to heal you. I'm here to lessen your pain, etc. Maybe to prevent, to hope, to guide you in a way that you won't fall into illness. Yeah, I agree. This is where the particular aliyah ends. It's and that's what the people need, because the people haven't experienced that kind of God. That was my main point, that they know of the God of war. They don't know of the God of healing, etc. And here we have that story. These are themes that we're going to pick up as we go through it's just the beginning of the journey. But at the beginning of the journey, you already see the bitter waters, and you see the complaints, and you already have the Chok Mishpat in the very beginning. So as we see, we'll maybe come back to these verses again in case we reread them. But your point is well taken. Ani Hashem Rofecha. We still have more time. Let me just take a couple more verses over here. The next one is in particular very interesting. It's one of these verses that was on the surface says nothing. When you think about it, it may be saying a lot. So we're traveling in the desert. And now in the very next verse, Vayavo Elima, we came to a place called Elim. V'sham shtei mesrei einot mayim v'shivim tmarim. Vayachanu sham alamayim. We came to a place called Elim. And in Elim, there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. And the people encamped beside the water. And when you read this verse, if you had the verse only by itself, you would say, okay, we later in the Torah, it describes the journeys of Israel through the desert, the 42 stops we made in the desert. And the Torah is telling us after we came to Marah, we went to Elim, and we encamped in Elim, and now we move forward. But when you read the verse in the context over here, first of all, they encamped by the waters. The sense over here is that these waters are healthy waters. There's 70 palm trees, there is 12 springs of water. But beyond that, the number 12 and the number 70 are very striking. We have a conjunction of 12 and 70. Now, where else do we have a conjunction of 12 and 70? Where are those two numbers coming together?
The tribes and the people
It's
that came from,
yes, but that is certainly the case, but that's certainly true. Certainly, that's correct. But I have had something else in mind where those two things actually come together in one story, the 12 and the 70, in a rather significant story. This is the beginning of the journey.
When
I
they
think
went
this
down,
class was called the Journey to Sinai.
when they
When we
went
come
down,
to Sinai, we stand at Mount Sinai, we hear the 10 Commandments. Moshe goes up the mountain, he brings down a whole other set of laws. He writes them in the book of the covenant. And the people say, Naseh v'nishma. And then two things happen in chapter 24 of this book. One thing is that Moshe builds an altar out of 12 stones. And he brings the sacrifice, and he throws the blood half on the people and half on the altar, right? The people say Naseh v'nishma, and right afterwards it says that Moshe took 70 people with him to experience God's presence, and they saw the God of Israel. You have those two events, they have the 12 and the 70, at one of the peaks of Jewish experience. The Naseh v'nishma, where the receiving of the Torah is confirmed in Exodus chapter 24, we have the 12 and the 70. And what's curious is, and you got to wonder about this, we just had Choku Mishpat when it came to Marah, and there was bitter waters, and now we come once again beside the water. We encamp beside the water, and we have the 12 and the 70. The Torah seems to be setting something up over here. And in light of this verse, this is a verse which actually introduces, in a certain sense, it's the introduction to the ultimate goal, or one of the two goals in this book, which is Sinai, covenant of Sinai. What's very striking truly striking, is that when you remember in the end of Bamidbar, in Parshat Maseh, the last parsha of Bamidbar, the Ewa Maseh B'nai, these are the journeys of Israel in the desert. Everybody remembers them. Was that chapter 33 of Bamidbar? Which is Maseh, let's say. Is it 33? I think it's 30. Yeah, it's chapter 33. Ewa Maseh B'nai Yisrael. If you remember chapter 33, so it simply is a list of the 42 stops that Israel travels in the desert. Almost all the places, maybe at least 35 of them, it just mentions the name. It doesn't mention anything else. On a few of them, it mentions what happened there. The most significant thing it mentions is the death of Aaron. Aaron dies, his son takes over, which is very significant because Aaron's death is the death of the first generation. His son taking over is the second generation. Fine. It begins with where we left Egypt from. We left Sukkot, we came to Yam Suf, right? We went to Marah. And then in chapter 33, verse number 9, Vayisu mi Marah, Vayavo Elima. We came to Elim. Uve'elim shtei mesrei enot mayim v'shivim tmarim vayachanu sham. When you read this verse, it's remarkable. It says nothing about Marah. We went to Marah. Here the Torah said in Marah we got Choku Mishpat. And most of the places says nothing, just mentions the name. We came to Elim, and in Elim there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees. They encamped there. What you see is, that's what I mentioned before, it's clear that Elim, for the reader of this story, has an enormous significance. Because why in the world, in a list of 42 stops. I understand why Aaron's death is mentioned. I understand why we left Egypt from is mentioned. But why would you mention 12 springs and 70 palm trees? So obviously, for the reader, there's something incredibly significant about Elim and the 70 palm trees. It doesn't mention, by the way, it doesn't mention what happened in Har Sinai. When you look at the list of the stops, it doesn't say, and we came to Har Sinai and we received the Torah. It's not mentioned. They went to Sinai. But here, Elim, it mentions the 12 springs and the 70 palm trees. I mean, whatever we make of this, okay? My point is, we have to be sensitive to biblical language. And this is quite remarkable. So it's clear that for the reader, this 12 and the 70 is a very important marker. And as I point out, it's exactly what you have later on in receiving the Torah in chapter 24. Vayisum Elim, Vayavo Koadat Bnei Yisrael El Midbar Sin Asher Bein Elim Ubein Sinai. B'chamishos hayom ha'chodesh hasheni l'tzeitam me'eretz Mitzrayim. Okay, so first of all, let me just point out, I'm not going to get into the dates over here, but notice we came to Midbar Sin. It's between Elim and Sinai. Right away, you see Elim and Sinai are very much connected. We came on the 15th day of the month. In the second month, it means 1 month later. We left Egypt on the 15th of the first month. This is the 15th of the second month. Vayilonu kol adat b'nei Yisrael al Moshe v'al Aaron b'midbar. Complaint, another Vayilonu. A complaint in the desert. Notice that the focus is the desert. The word desert here is very significant. Midbar Sin, right? Vayilonu b'midbar. Vayomru alehem b'nei Yisrael. Mi'itein mutenu b'yad Hashem b'yeretz Mitzrayim. V'shivtenu al-sira b'asar b'yachlenu lechem v'sova. Ki otzetem otanu al-hamidbar hazeh lamit ekla kahol hazeh bara'av. 3 times the word midbar appears, and the people complained. Would we had died in the land of Egypt. We sat by the flesh pots. We had a fill of bread. Bread doesn't, in the Bible, doesn't mean just bread. Bread means food that sustains you. Sometimes meat is called bread. Karbani lachmi. There we had that to sustain us. You have taken us into the desert to kill us with famine. Now, once again, the complaint seems completely valid. What are we going to eat? It would appear that up to this point, for whatever reason, they had enough food. It's only 30 days later, the commentaries discuss where were they eating the first 30 days. Okay, but now they're actually in the desert. That's the focus. Maybe up to now was on the edges of the desert, not the actual desert. Now the question is clear. What are we going to eat? Nothing grows in the desert. Once again, Vayilonu is a complaint. So we'll have to stop at this point, but we will see that right away in the very next verse, God will actually tell Moshe, this is how I plan to feed the people. What's very interesting is, we'll start with this next time, it doesn't appear to be a direct response to the people. It's not, and God said, tell the people not to complain, I'm going to do this. But it's actually, in the next verse, it sounds like independent of the people's complaint, God already has a plan. The plan will center around this man. And just to make one point before I stop about the man, the story of the man is a very important story in the Torah. It appears, it's virtually an entire chapter of chapter 16. And there's another story of the man in the book of Bamidbar that we'll have to look at, parallel story, a parallel account. And not only that, the man is referenced in the book of Dvarim. Each time it's a little different. So we have to understand that it's pretty much at the center of the book. So we'll start next week with the man. people have any other questions, you can always email me, dsilber@drisha.org. And we will continue with the Mun, which is one of the central stories as we journey through the desert. So, okay, so we'll continue next week. Always good to study with you.
All right.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. And with that, have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.